Happy Sunday, everybody. Hope you're all doing well. Today's topic is one that I've been thinking about for a while. This is not a new thought that I've had, that the church should sell off its media properties. I'm going to go through a few arguments as to why and then some conclusions. You know, I've written a lot of op-eds for the Deseret News over the years. And it's very interesting to see some of the editorial positions taken by the church's paper, some of the journalistic decisions chosen by KSL. And speaking from my own experience, I mean, there's been occasions when I've quoted a Bible verse or two or three in an op-ed and I was told to remove them, which I always thought was weird, that the church's newspaper would have an editorial standard that suggested not quoting from the scriptures. Now, I could perhaps see like, oh, not the Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants, whatever, but the Bible. Like, I always kind of scratch my head at that. I've also had op-eds rejected because they were on topics that were, shall we say, controversial, overly controversial for mainstream LDS church audience. I've had op-eds where I was told to edit out certain portions if I wanted to publish them. And those portions that I was told to edit out were fairly substantive and I think doctrinally sound. So I've always kind of had those questions. But this musing is for a broader purpose, not just my own reflections and experience, but observations about other editorial and journalistic concerns that have been happening over the many years at the church's media outlets. So let's rattle off a few. There are many more, but I don't want this to be a super long one, so I'll just share a few. The first one that came to mind was during the FDR era. So I'm going to start with editorial concerns, and then we'll go over some journalistic concern examples. So I'm going to quote from a book called Presidents and Prophets, which is a book written by Mike Winder about kind of a historical compilation of interactions that church presidents have had with presidents of the United States. So in that book, Winder is talking about the interactions with church leaders regarding FDR. So it says that church president Heber J. Grant was vocal in his disapproval of the policies of the 32nd president, FDR, especially after the death of his pro-Roosevelt first counselor, Anthony B. Ivins, in September 1934. He would often become upset when discussing FDR, and in one heated discussion, slammed his cane on the desk of Franklin Murdoch, shattering the glass desktop in his anti-Roosevelt fury. It comes as no surprise, then, that in the election of 1936, President Grant openly endorsed the Republican candidate for president. However, he pointed out that he was speaking for himself and not for the church. We'll get into that in just a moment. As the 1936 election drew near, an unsigned front-page editorial in the church-owned Deseret News accused FDR of knowingly promoting unconstitutional laws and advocating communism. However, the other candidate, it said, has declared he stands for the Constitution and for the American system. Although many Roosevelt-loving Mormons were upset over the editorial, one future church leader was persuaded. Future First Presidency member Marion G. Romney, a staunch Democrat, committed to vote for Franklin Roosevelt, was deeply torn. When the editorial appeared, Romney's biographer said, he felt as if his political life had collapsed around him. After fasting and 3 hours of prayer, Marion concluded that the editorial was inspired. Keep that in mind. An unsigned editorial from the Deseret News, not attributing any name specifically. Here's Romney, a political opponent, you might say, to Grant's position, President Grant, nonetheless concluding that the editorial, not a First Presidency statement, not an ensign article, not a general conference address, but an unsigned editorial in the Deseret News, he was persuaded that it was inspired and given through the Lord's prophet. He then reversed his political loyalties and labored to dissuade his friends from voting for FDR. In 1936, FDR won every state in the Union except Maine and Vermont. As convincing as the victory was nationally, it was even more so in Utah, where FDR had over 69% of the vote. Determined that Utah should not vote for FDR for a third term in 1940, the general authorities once again drafted a joint anti-Roosevelt statement, but settled on issuing a less dramatic, unsigned editorial. President Grant deferred to those who thought too bold a statement would cause problems for the church, without much hope of changing votes, and came to the horrified conclusion that, quote, about half the Latter-day Saints almost worship him, end quote. He regarded the strong LDS support for the president and his, quote, neo-socialism as, quote, one of the most serious conditions that has confronted me since I became president of the church, end quote. Final paragraph from Winter's book. In 1940, Utah was one of the strongest pro-FDR states, giving him over 62% of the vote, and his opponent under 38%. When the pro-FDR tallies came in on election night in Utah, President Grant saw the total and was dumbfounded. Part of the explanation was the fact that up to 3/4 of the population of rural Utah received federal relief, and a higher proportion of LDS Utahns obtained federal relief than did non-LDS Utahns. And at election time, it was a simple financial decision that no editorial could sway. All right, so the point there with this historical example from nearly a century ago is that the Deseret News was used as a vehicle to issue statements that church leaders wanted to have issued with the premature of First Presidency approval, the perception thereof, without directly having to associate their names with it. In the second occasion, general authorities got together, they drafted a joint statement, and yet settled on, quote, issuing a less dramatic, unsigned editorial. This was at the direction of church leaders. This shows the connection, at least a century ago, between the church and their owned media enterprise. Okay, a few other examples. 2009, I remember seeing this editorial, the title of which says, "Get a flu shot." It says, this is Deseret News editorial. "Roll up your sleeve. This will only sting for a second. Seriously, drag your hindquarters off the lazy boy and get down to the local health department, your personal physician, or your corner pharmacy and get a flu shot." I should point out that every time I say get a flu shot in this editorial, they italicized it in their editorial, adding emphasis. Get a flu shot. They continue. "We're not talking the H1N1 variety. We're talking the garden variety seasonal influenza, the flu that kills about 36,000 Americans a year, but doesn't get nearly the same degree of attention as the swine flu, or more correctly, H1N1 influenza. Some experts say," experts, quote unquote, "some experts say it's your civic duty to get a flu shot." Italicized, get a flu shot. "Think about how many healthcare resources are expended each flu season on an illness that is largely preventable. If all goes as planned, Utah physician offices, clinics, and hospitals will weather this flu season as they normally do. But they run on thin margins. If a mass casualty occurs at the peak of flu season, the healthcare system could be swamped, financially speaking. That's the last thing we want to happen in this economic climate. So, go get a shot," italicized. "If you won't do that, then at least wash your hands frequently or use hand sanitizer. Avoid sick people. Don't touch your eyes, nose, mouth, etc. Or you can tempt fate. Here's what you have to look forward to should you contract the flu: fever, usually high, headache, muscle aches, chills, extreme tiredness, dry cough, runny nose, and possibly nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea, which are more common in children, but also possible among adults. Surely you have better things to do with your time." Parenthetically, doesn't this remind you of during COVID, the Biden administration saying that the unvaccinated will look forward to a winter of death, right? Like, if you don't get vaccinated, you're going to be sick, you're going to die, your family members are going to die, it's going to be horrible, and yet it didn't happen. I'm getting those vibes from this editorial. So, it says, get off the dime. Go get a shot, italicized. It concludes thusly: "The Centers for Disease Control," the esteemed CDC that we know is crap, CDC says vaccination is particularly important for young children, pregnant women, people with chronic health conditions like asthma, diabetes, heart, lung disease, or people 65 years and older. People in these categories are at greater risk of flu complications. The best course is not to contract the flu. Healthy habits and vaccination are your best bet. Go get a flu shot. Now, the church's positions on vaccines is very clear. They're very pro-vaccine. The stupid thing with an editorial like this is the flu vaccination is not an immunization against the flu. They literally guess which strain is going to be the dominant one because these things mutate and ebb and flow and everything. It's a total guess game as to whether the mass-produced flu vaccinations that are produced and propagandized and pushed on everyone, like with this editorial, is even going to be effective against the dominant strain in that following season's flu. And so here again, the question becomes, okay, like the church being so pro-vaccine, as we saw during COVID and everything else especially, were church leaders the ones pushing this type of narrative and saying that you should go get a flu shot, even though it's largely ineffective. In some cases, a lot of cases, it gives people the flu who otherwise wouldn't have gotten it. Here's one a few years later. Again, editorials. We're just talking editorials for now. 2014, title, Military Cuts Send the Wrong Message to the World. A couple little quotes from it. The United States holds a unique place in the international community. It has proven itself capable of responding to threats to freedom whenever they emerge. If certain nations know the United States is weakened militarily, they may also calculate that their own military actions are worth the gamble. The result could be a more dangerous world. And then it continues. The Obama administration believes voters gave it a mandate to end U.S. involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan. While many in the U.S. did seem to be losing enthusiasm for these conflicts, interesting choice of words, did seem to be losing enthusiasm for these conflicts, there is little evidence to suggest either nation is capable of maintaining its own security. Again, this is 2014, a decade into the war. It continues, as inconvenient as it may seem at times, inconvenient, the United States has military obligations and a reputation for strength that likely keeps greater belligerence at bay and makes the world safer. You could not have asked for a greater endorsement of the military-industrial complex and American imperialism than this editorial from the Deseret News in 2014, saying that cutting the military at all sends the wrong message to the world. What I want to convey throughout this musing is that these media institutions, in many cases, are not mouthpieces for Christ's kingdom. They are organs for Caesar's propaganda. They do not serve the cause of our faith. They end up being a net negative by parroting all the Caesarian propaganda and talking points and justifications and worldly traditions of our fathers and idolatry. Like Spencer Kimball's saying, right? We're a warlike people, that when enemies rise up, we become anti-enemy rather than pro-kingdom of God. And here is the church's own newspaper editorializing in complete opposition to what President Kimball said. So again, the question becomes, to what extent are church leaders aware of and authorizing these types of editorials, or are they directing them? We'll hold off on that question and come back to it a little bit later. You know, the doctrinal command, as I've shared on past musing, is to renounce war, proclaim peace. And here's the church doing, well, the Deseret News at least, doing the opposite. I remember this one distinctly, 2017. We were driving the medical cannabis initiative in Utah, getting signatures, trying to get it on the ballot. And then one of the church's senior editorial columnists wrote an opinion piece saying, voters aren't qualified to make marijuana decisions. And then it reads, the deceptive part of any medical marijuana initiative is that supporters want you to believe it's a simple matter and that you have the expertise to make such a decision. You haven't. No one does currently. With legal access to marijuana available in so many neighboring states, it's important Utah gets it right. Unfortunately, voters simply aren't qualified to make that decision. A couple years later, 2019, red flag laws with Deseret News advocating disarming innocent people. They were editorializing in favor of a law that would allow someone's guns to be taken by an ex parte order from a judge. What that means is that the person would not be able to defend themselves against an allegation. They would not appear to the judge and try to rebut what their neighbor or, sibling or whoever was saying, trying to get this order. So red flag laws can basically disarm innocent people. And the Deseret News was editorializing in favor. I remember, I'm going to go back to 2002 really quick. I've shared this before on a past musing, when after 9/11, in the October 2002 General Conference, just as war was really starting to heat up, then Elder Russell Nelson gave a great talk on being peacemakers and applying the golden rule, not just to your neighbor or your coworker, but to other countries, and doing unto other countries as we would want, to have done unto us. And basically applying the doctrinal position to this geopolitical conflict when everyone else was just getting swept up in this, Middle East anti-Iraq, anti-Afghanistan, anti-everybody fervor, anti-enemy fervor, just like President Kimball said, becoming anti-enemy instead of pro-kingdom of God. Here was Elder Nelson being pro-kingdom of God, saying, here's what Christ has taught, here's what we have to do, while the war drums were just beating, right? Including among other church leaders who were basically saying, yeah, okay, we stand behind our, leaders and governments and we go to war. President Nelson, then Elder Nelson, gave a great talk. And then the Associated Press came out with their article the day after, and it said, Apostle Russell M. Nelson didn't mention Iraq or President Bush's case for toppling Saddam Hussein's regime, but urged patience and negotiation in resolving the conflict in the Middle East. Quote, as a church, we must renounce war and proclaim peace, Nelson said in his sermon Saturday, which is literally verbatim from Doctrine and Covenants. The Associated Press continues, since the sermon, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has declared its support for Bush, most clearly in a Wednesday editorial in the church-owned Deseret News. Quote, Saddam Hussein and the threat he represents to the United States and her allies will not go away on its own, the editorial said, continuing the quote, this time the nation may well have to strike first. And then it concluded that, quote, Americans have known they must face Saddam again sooner or later. It appears the time has come. Elder Nelson, teaching doctrine, getting attacked the next day by Caesar's propaganda organs. Unsurprisingly, the military-industrial complex doesn't like its dissidents. So they come attacking with the Associated Press and everybody else, claiming that, we're anti-war and we're not on Team America and everything else. The church's PR department backtracks, and then presumably church leaders direct an editorial in the Deseret News to try to mitigate the damage and take a pro-war position. So much so that the Associated Press here says, and again I quote, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has declared its support for Bush, most clearly in a Wednesday editorial in the church-owned Deseret News. So this is like 4 days after the talk was given. Whether it's true or not, the perception is clear and internationally recognized that the editorial in this case, and in general, the editorial in the church-owned Deseret News reflected, in this case, the position of the church. The Associated Press looking at this is saying, well, yeah, it's the church's paper. This editorial came out. That is the church declaring its support for Bush. Now, maybe some people in the church would say, oh, no, First Presidency or apostles, nobody was involved. Nobody told the Deseret News to write that editorial. I'm going to get into that in just a little bit because I think it's disingenuous. At least the perception exists, whether it's true or not, that influence is there, that it is substantial. And so when the church's own media organ undercut the powerful doctrinal remarks that President Nelson, Elder Nelson, had shared, the church's official position became contrary to doctrine, which Elder Nelson had been teaching. And so the perception of members was that it was okay to be pro-war, anti-Saddam Hussein, pro-Bush, go fight in the Middle East and get vengeance for, 9/11, even though Saddam had nothing to do with 9/11, and on and on and on and on. But many church members then believed that, it's in the Deseret News, and so this is the church's official position. And then all the so-called Gentiles, non-members of the church, like the Associated Press, clearly believe that to be the case as well. Oh, here's the LDS Church's position because the Deseret News wrote an editorial on this. And the lack of clarity around who is in charge and who authorizes or directs which editorials, the lack of any knowledge about that leads one to conclude that the control is pervasive and ever-present. Because there is no rubric, there is no criteria to say, in this case, the Deseret News editorial or the KSL, whatever, is speaking for the church, and in this case it isn't. So the presumption becomes that everything that's published there is with the blessing and under the direction of the owners of these media outlets, which is the LDS Church. Very disappointing in that case. Very disappointing. Which is why I suppose I've shared it many times. All right, so let's go from there are other editorial examples, but for time I'm going to continue on to some journalistic concerns. The one that popped on my radar was 5 or 6 years ago. I started to realize how often the Deseret News and KSL would quote the Southern Poverty Law Center, one of the most ridiculous institutions that is extremely progressive and left-leaning and claims that anyone who supports limited government and pro-family policies and pro-life, whatever, is a hate group. I should point out here that one of my life goals is to have Libertas Institute be so impactful that we get classified as a hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center. The fact that we are not yet on their list of Utah hate groups is sad to me. It shows that I still have room to grow and influence to build. As an example, here is what the website, the Southern Poverty Law Center's website, says for Utah hate groups. Of course, they track this all over the country, but I'll just share Utah since that's where I live. The Constitution Party of Utah, claiming, as with all these examples actually, that it's an anti-government movement. The Eagle Forum, which is just like some social conservatives, nice old ladies. Liberty News Network, this kind of like constitutionalist, liberty-leaning, little media outlet that some guys are trying to grow. Liberty Roundtable, similarly. Loving Liberty Network. Oath Keepers, like claiming that all these, pro-freedom, pro-America, pro-Constitution type people are part of an anti-government movement and a hate group. And the church's media outlets again and again and again quote the Southern Poverty Law Center without any criticism. They quote them as an expert. According to them, here's all these hate groups and here's all these problems going on. There's an article, I found a bunch of articles this morning when I was digging it up, but one article, they glowingly refer to this data from the experts at the Southern Poverty Law Center, and there's no critics cited at all. There's no balanced journalism. There's no one there to express the opposition talking point that this institution is not credible and should not even be regarded as, experts at anything. So there's one example of journalistic concerns. Another one is the whole Trump derangement syndrome. Like during the 2020 election, it was huge, especially with KSL, so much so that Senator Mike Lee got involved and he started harping on KSL in particular, talking about how often they were carrying water for the Democrats. So they were attacking Trump, attacking conservatives. And so there was a hullabaloo at the time because Senator Lee was on social media pushing this same thesis that I am, that the church should, sell off these media outlets. I'm going to read from a post that Senator Lee shared at the time. This is 3 years ago. He said that KSL and the Associated Press have not been shy in letting us know where they stand relative to the Republican Party. Hint, they don't really like it. Quote, he's quoting from KSL and the Associated Press here. Last week, the Democrats created a well-received roll call via video montage. A roll call is a vote, where everyone has to cast their vote. Via video montage with diverse officials and others from states across the country. The Republicans, overwhelmingly white, spoke from the ballroom floor. Mike Lee continues, in the same article, Associated Press and KSL refer to the ultra-leftist Southern Poverty Law Center, here's another example, in terms that imply even-handedness and political neutrality, describing SPLC as an entity that, quote, catalogs the country's hate groups. Who could be against such a group that does only that? They, of course, make no mention of the fact that SPLC labels legitimate, non-hateful Christian and conservative entities like the Family Research Council as, quote, hate groups. KSL and the Associated Press have every right to express their opinions, and all fight for their legal right to do so. But make no mistake, they are left-leaning media enterprises. The fact that KSL is less left-leaning than the Salt Lake Tribune, which at least has the decency to acknowledge what it is, doesn't make it not so. Senator Lee concludes, I really would like to know, does KSL prefer the Democratic Party? Does it oppose the re-election of President Trump? If so, does that preference reflect the views of its owner, which has long maintained a position of neutrality with regard to partisan political elections? Many, I suspect, including some within KSL, would have us believe that all three of those questions can be answered in the affirmative, perhaps as a signal to members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Maybe the same individuals would prefer to leave those conclusions unsaid and implied, making KSL's anti-Republican, anti-conservative, and anti-Trump effort easier and less messy. That's precisely what makes it so dangerous. So Senator Lee actually followed up in a little comment. I'll just read this portion, then we'll move on. He said, I don't fault the church here. This is probably an impossible task, owning a media empire while maintaining a degree of political impartiality that is appropriate for the church. I say probably because I think it's possible to thread the needle here, even though it would be very, very difficult. The left has largely captured the news media in this country and almost entirely commandeered the journalistic profession. So it'd take an act of heroism to run a media empire that isn't decidedly part of either the crusade or the counter-crusade. So the example here, especially with the Trump derangement syndrome, utilizing heavily, and I'll talk about this in a minute too, the Associated Press as this source of all this content, and then implying this kind of blessing by spreading this content through the church's official media organs. 2022, just last year, more regurgitation from the Associated Press. This article, billions projected to suffer nearly unlivable heat in 2070. Total scaremongering on the likes of Paul Ehrlich, who I've talked about before, population bomb, half a century ago, claiming that, by this date everyone would die and there would be famines and there wouldn't be no food. And all these doom and gloomers are anti-God, anti-family, anti-human. They think there need to be fewer of us. We need to have fewer children, even though God has said to multiply and replenish the earth. They think that there are scarce resources that we're running out of because humans are a parasite on this world, even though the doctrinal position is, from the Doctrine and Covenants, that there is enough and to spare. And so here's KSL giving the stamp of approval for people who don't read closely enough that this is a tiny little byline from the Associated Press. They're going to KSL. Their mindset is this is the safe space for members of the church to get access to information. And you have all this total progressive garbage sliding in through the Associated Press. It's no wonder that Senator Lee and others were concerned, because that institution and most other mainstream corporate media outlets are very left-leaning, and they're very, anti-God in a lot of their positions. 2020, during COVID, Bonneville fired a sports announcer who had been working there since 1988. Bonneville is the parent company of a lot of the church's media enterprises, because he tweeted, "All lives matter." And a bunch of BLM activists got in a tizzy and called for his head. And Bonneville fired this guy who had been working there for, 32 years? And they canned him because on his personal Twitter feed, he said that all lives matter, which, again, is kind of the doctrinally correct position as well. And Bonneville canned him. This was also from 2020. KSL article, school district condemns abhorrent, quote, in Salt Lake High School yearbook. I'm reading from the article. According to the Facebook post, the yearbook, quote, says, quote, there are 2 genders and a lot of mental illnesses. And then they quote a student from the school saying, this is a clear attack towards the trans community at Highland. As a member of the LGBTQ+, this was extremely offensive to me and many of the students at my school. And then Jeremy Chatterton, who started in July as the school's new principal, said, and I quote, the inclusion of this quote in the yearbook is more than just an administrative oversight. It is an affront, an attack on our Highland community and our LGBTQIA+ community in particular. As principal, I will not allow hate speech like this in my school community. While the student in question has graduated, I want to reassure community members that I will take the steps necessary to make sure something like this is never allowed to happen again. He encouraged students who have been impacted by the quote to email him to make an appointment with the school counselor, thus proving the yearbook statement about mental illness, perhaps. My point in sharing this here was that there was no counterpoint mentioned at all. The church has very clear doctrinal positions on a lot of these types of issues about gender being a pre-mortal, mortal, and post-mortal identity. And the church's own media outlets are pushing a favorably quoting all of the left-leaning everybody on this matter. There wasn't even a scintilla of rebuttal or opposition. There was no interviewing of pro-family groups or anything. Like when you look at abortion articles in the church's outlets, very rarely, they quote Planned Parenthood way more than they quote, any pro-life group. And so why is this, right? You peel back the layers and you realize, well, all the reporters working at the church's media enterprises are coming out of these colleges and the woke campuses and the woke social media and the woke culture is producing a certain type of people. And so these are largely all left-leaning people who buy into these types of ideologies, even though they work at the church's outlets. And so it's infecting everything that the church's outlets are doing, which itself is a reason to sell these off when you have basically political activists and people who heavily believe certain ideologies working at these institutions. I shared in one of my early musings, there was this BYU Forum speech in 2022 by Reverend William J. Barber II. And at the time, I was very critical of a Deseret News article about that forum, which showered him with praise and reported about the standing ovation he got. And everyone was so happy. Here's this guy talking about the need to unite people across the country to help poor people. And BYU students just clapping. And so my criticism was that at no point in the Deseret News article was an opposition point even considered. So it was this propaganda puff piece just glowingly talking about this reverend who was advocating for Marxist policies as the basis for addressing poverty. Again, this kind of anti-human, anti-capitalist, anti-freedom position was the basis of his remarks. He was demanding government reparations and subsidized housing. It just rattled off this litany of left-leaning policy recommendations as the purported solution to poverty. And so that was my criticism last year. Well, then again, there's even more articles from him in like KSL and others. Zero commentary from anyone who disagrees. No rebuttals, no doctrinal clarifications, no, not that I would think most BYU professors would be great, but no quoting from anyone connected to our faith that would say, well, we actually think that, self-reliance is a key to not only prosperity, but peace and a godly life. And we need to empower people to help themselves and not have these huge central planning laws being passed that steal from people to redistribute to others, because that's not the basis of what Christ has asked us to do, blah, 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 blah. There's nobody advocating for that, which you might say, well, maybe the journalists tried and they just couldn't find anyone to express that talking point, which itself is a problematic statement if true, because then it suggests that so many people in our church-centric community, academics, activists, organizational leaders, and others, so few of them hold these positions to even be consulted and quoted by the journalists. Maybe there's hardly anyone out there who openly believes and advocates these other ideas. Who knows? I'm going to guess the journalists were just lazy and writing a propaganda puff piece by quoting from a press release and, meeting deadline to move on to their next thing. Earlier this year, there was the whole corruption scandal with Hunter Biden and the House Oversight Committee revealing all this corruption. And like KSL was completely silent. There was nothing on the TV. There was nothing like, there was an article eventually on KSLTV.com, but like, all this other puff piece, all this other random stuff, but not this very clear, instance of corruption. Okay. So moving on, why should the church sell? Why should the church sell off the media enterprise? It's one thing, I'm not advocating that the church should not own for-profit companies or have revenue-generating enterprises that can help create additional, wealth for the kingdom. That's totally fine. Owning a dairy farm or a food processing plant or whatever doesn't create controversy. Owning a mall does. Topic for another day. But largely speaking, like just owning a company is fine. That's not the issue. It's not that the church, it's a nonprofit, you shouldn't be engaged in for-profit activity. That's not the concern at all. The concern is that this particular type of company, this particular type of enterprise, implicitly has an editorial voice. It has a political, a theological implication to it, because these institutions are about spreading ideas, not just giving you food or making shirts or selling refurbished furniture at DI or whatever, right? It's not about just non-controversial, non-ideological things. It is very ideological and it is very controversial. And so it's the nature of this institution, these media enterprises, that I think is the core reason why the church should jettison them. Because the implication that they've allowed to happen and that they've benefited from for a long time is that whatever they're publishing has the sanction and direction of church leaders, that they can use as needed to, as we saw a century ago, express the positions of the church without having to directly cite first presidency involvement or authorship. At a minimum, I think the church should be radically clear. If the church isn't going to sell, which they're not, at a minimum, they should be radically clear about separating any editorial influence. There should be very clear policies about a disconnect or a connection between the editorial positions of these institutions, these media outlets, and the church. But of course, even if there's a separation, even if they say, we have complete editorial independence from henceforth and forever, church leaders will not direct the editorial positions of these outlets, the first presidency will not direct the publication of any editorials, no apostles will, etc., etc., etc. Even if they did that, I don't think anything would change. Because Deseret News and KSL and others, they're not going to bite the hand that feeds them. They're going to self-censor. They're going to say only that which they perceive to be appropriate and aligned with the leaders of the church. There will be a wink and a nod or a back channel conversation or a subtle implication about a position to take or whatever, because that's how these things go as humans in these large institutions. But even if there's some public divorce or disconnection on the editorial side, I don't think anything really changes. Because if you know who your employer is, you're not going to do anything to intentionally offend them or upset them. And it's important to point out here, the Deseret Management Corporation, which is kind of the umbrella company over all these for-profit institutions, who's on the board? Well, it's the first presidency, the presiding bishopric, and then 3 apostles who rotate in and out. So these media outlets are directly overseen by the upper echelons of the LDS Church, which further adds to the implication that there is a connection in these editorial positions and journalistic practices. Okay, a few questions, and then we'll wrap with a conclusion. Question. With every other media outlet getting it wrong, where should the saints turn for truth? The Deseret News, the KSLs of the world, they could be great mouthpieces for our faith. But as shown with the whole Elder Nelson thing and being peacemakers, renouncing war, proclaiming peace, they routinely get it wrong. It's easier to reprint Caesar's Associated Press wire, where they just are pumping out stories. It's easier to reprint that than to employ the right people, instill the right culture, maintain an editorial standard focused on the faith's core beliefs. I mean, that's tough. That takes intentionality. That takes pissing some people off because not everyone's going to agree with it. But instead, it's like this bland, don't offend anyone, whatever, right? As for using the Associated Press, by the way, this is a quote from the president of Deseret Digital Media, Greg Peterson. He says that it was a function born of necessity. Quote, as a local media outlet, we do not have the luxury of a cadre of reporters in Washington, and so we are dependent to some degree on wire services for national and international coverage. So because the church doesn't want to pay for its own reporters who maintain its culture and share its faith and have its perspective to communicate with Latter-day Saints through the church's own media enterprise, they just rely on Associated Press people to just churn out these stories, dominated by left-leaning people who hate what we stand for. And that's what we now publish with the blessing and imprint of the church's upper echelons of leadership, and we pump out all this left-leaning garbage with a stamp of approval. Like, if the church is going to do this, then lean into it and invest more resources and do it right. Hire the right people. You can hire a few reporters for national and international news. There is, enough pennies in the couch cushions of the church to afford this. I think that's a cop-out and an excuse. Yes, Deseret News and KSL, like every media outlet, they've been laying people off over the many years, and they've been downsizing, and it's been a challenge for that industry. But the church has resources sufficient to more heavily subsidize its operations. And so I don't really buy that as an excuse as to why we have to use all this just Caesarian left-leaning garbage. And then I mentioned before, like the talent pipeline of the church. Talent pipeline for these media outlets, that the people that they're hiring are coming out of these woke campuses and woke journalistic programs. And those are the social justice warriors and the mind, these people who see themselves as activists, not journalists. Okay, another question. How does the filth from the corporate media not rub off on the church? If the church is going to play this game and own these media outlets and have affiliations with NBC for KSL and the Associated Press for KSL and the Deseret News and own all these other media outlets that they do, if they're going to play this game, how does the filth from corporate media, the propaganda, the left-leaning everything, the fact that they're carrying water for Caesar rather than challenging Caesar, how does that not rub off on the church? It's a diseased association between the two, which leads to the next question. Is church leadership content with the current arrangement? One would have to conclude then that church leaders, as no one would be surprised by, are more left-leaning and moderate than the, Bensons and McKays and others of the world who were more politically conservative. And that church leaders benefit, again, from this presumption of, yes, editorials come from the church, but hey, we have some wiggle room because we don't have to put our names on it, and so we can let people believe that it came from us, but then there's this open question, so there's plausible deniability. There's a benefit to, leadership to have that type of wiggle room. And then, a final question. Are Deseret News and KSL merely propaganda organs for a large institution? Will these outlets ever be critical of their employer when criticism is warranted? And I don't mean that the church should be criticized. I just mean that there are some things that a critical journalist should and would explore that might be unflattering to the church or to church leaders. And will KSL and the Deseret News ever take that position of criticism and impartiality? Well, of course not. So they become really a propaganda arm for a large corporate institution with heavy incentives to not say anything that is too critical. Which leads me to a few conclusions. Number one, the church has what could be an amazing platform to spread truth and spread freedom. But instead, they sow fear. I mean, look at the COVID coverage. My God, in the true sense of that term. like, oh my gosh, The fear, the propaganda, the state and authority worship, woke culture, everything else, the uncritical praise of socialist people and LGBTQIA plus blah blah activists and everything else. The fact that there's no balance, there's no perspective shared from those who have perhaps the church's traditional position on the matters, and on and on and on. The church is not, through these outlets, spreading truth and freedom. It's giving a platform to the enemies of those things. Another concluding point. If the church was dissatisfied with the editorial direction of the Deseret News, all they'd have to do is pick up the phone. It's as simple as that, right? So the fact that that hasn't happened with some of these editorials that I shared before should tell you something. Because they could stop it. They could go in a different direction. They oversee it. They control it. So the fact that they don't suggests that this type of content is in line with many in current church leadership. Another concluding point, editorial advancement of a political agenda with the perceived mantle of the church is unrighteous dominion. So without clarifying the church's backing or the lack of backing, without being radically clear about the church's influence and direction or involvement or approval, becomes unrighteous dominion. It is intentionally confusing the saints. It is allowing those in power to have their cake and eat it too, by having the wiggle room to, have official positions of the church that are unofficially official because it's in the church's media organ, but not coming from the first presidency in the church newsroom. Like, the lack of clarity here creates spiritual chaos. You have people losing their testimonies because there's no clarity and they don't know, and they see something that they oppose, and then they're, struggling and have a faith crisis and everything else, right? And so my concluding point, final one then, is that I don't think these institutions are really advancing the cause of Christ. My concluding point is the very first thing I said. I don't think that these are institutions that are advancing Christ's kingdom. I think oftentimes they're organs for Caesar's kingdom. They're regurgitating all of the pablum from, the political corrupt corporate media without context, without clarification, without criticism, without balance. And so that's not to say that these companies should go away necessarily. I just think that the church's ownership of them, because they're being run so poorly from a theological kingdom building perspective, there should be a disconnect. They should be separated. That's not to say there aren't good people in these institutions. I know many of them. I interact with these people, many of the people who work here. There's, great people working at all these places. It's not the individuals, it's the corporate setup and the implications, the theological implications of the current corporate relationship. And I think more clarity would come simply by selling them off. It would be very, very clear then that what these institutions say don't represent the church. That if you want to know what the church says, go to the church's newsroom there and only there, and not have this kind of like filtered, whatever. I lack the term. Whatever you want to call these media outlets, not being official, but they're kind of unofficially official, and people have the perception that they're authoritative and from the church, with total confusion about if and when they are. And I think that confusion and that spiritual chaos would be mitigated substantially, if not entirely, by simply selling them off. The church can continue to publish the church news and the Liahona and its website and social media and everything else to have a very focused doctrinal thing. But when they're playing the corporate media game and the political game and hiring these woke social justice warriors who, don't even believe the same things, and they're bringing with them all their baggage, and they're infecting the corporate culture and pushing, their agenda, quoting people they want, not quoting other people. Like, when you're playing that game, it's just creating chaos. That's fine for any worldly media outlet. Anyone wants to start a media, knock yourself out. The issue here is that if Christ's kingdom has direct ownership and the implication is that it represents the views of this institution, as we saw the Associated Press quote with the whole Elder Nelson thing after 9/11, that is where the danger comes in. That is where there needs to be a disconnect. And if there's not going to be, there needs to be a cleansing of how this is all done, so that there is far more clarity, so that there is far more doctrinal congruence, so that there is more unabashed support for the church's doctrine and its positions, and not just being a normal, corporate organ that is trying to play both sides. As Neil Maxwell said, trying to have a summer cottage in Babylon. So the easy route is just sell them off. You could probably find someone to buy them, turn it into a nonprofit like the Deseret News, give a transition period to help, transition it to a new owner. I just think the church and the kingdom would be better served by not playing in this corporate media world. Maintain your own media presence to just, publish your own views and activities in this new media world that's increasingly easy to do. And then we could avoid all the spiritual chaos and confusion that happens as a result of the current situation. I've spoken my piece. See you next Sunday.